Hi, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you about the Australian Green Bands movement, which occurred here in the first half of the 1970s, and it was a wonderfully inspiring example of the ability of workers to use their power at the point of production in defence of the environment. Now, the power of labour to confront polluters of the environment is usually discounted in academic discussions of ecological problems. For example, Ulrich Beck, who's famous for his writing about risk, ignores the role of unions when dealing with the question of how to confront ecological risk. He gives an example of a lead crystal factory dropping flecks of lead and arsenic on nearby Altenstadt, and he writes about the importance of a strong, competent public debate and dissenting voices and alternative experts. Yet public outrage in the instance he discusses achieved absolutely nothing. So if you lived in Altenstadt, would you rather rely on the workers employed there to refuse to continue working until the polluting emissions ceased, or would you prefer to rely on dissenting voices and alternative experts? The Green Bands movement in Australia in the 1970s utilised the collective power of workers to defend the environment from the rapacious acts of developers only interested in profits. And because it used workers' power to withdraw labour and create havoc, the entire society noticed. It became polarised on the issue and opinions were altered, and most importantly, important old buildings, working class residential areas and green spaces were saved. The union concerned was the New South Wales branch of the Australian Builders Labourers Federation, which covered all unskilled labourers and some semi-skilled labourers employed on building sites. These industrial bands had the full-hearted support of the rank-and-file unionists who imposed them. They were never placed without majority support. Jack Mundy, who led this movement, appealed to the builders' labourers to take a total view. He said, "What is the good of fighting to improve wages and conditions if we are going to choke to death in polluted and planless cities? Workers should be concerned about every aspect of life, not just their working conditions." Now, the green bands were of three main kinds: to defend open green spaces from development, to protect existing housing stock from demolition to make way for freeways or motorways or high-rise development, and to preserve older style buildings from replacement by high-rise office blocks or shopping precincts. More than 40 green bans were imposed. About half of these prevented the destruction of individual buildings or parks, green areas, but the other half thwarted development projects affecting very, very large areas, whole suburbs, including the area known as the Rocks on Sydney Cove, on Sydney Harbour, where the British first settled here in Australia in 1788. So it was only a green ban that prevented the oldest buildings in the country from being torn down and replaced by concrete and glass office towers. Now, obviously, the tourism industry has benefited hugely from that green ban preventing that particular ridiculous project. Now, Jack Mundy coined the term green bands in May 1973, a few years after the movement started, and he said that green bands was a better way to get across the environmental component than the traditional union term of black bands. And that greatly assisted the word green to enter the political vernacular. Of course, Petra Kelly visited Australia in the mid-1970s, and she was so inspired by the Green Bands movement that she took back to Germany that green terminology, and that's why she named her party the Green Party. And from then on, the green became common terminology for environmental parties and movements. Now, by 1975, these green bands had stalled $5,000 million worth of development at mid-1970s prices. It was hugely challenging to property capital at the time. Green bans were also imposed by other state branches of this union, and that saved threatened bush and parkland and historic buildings in Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Canberra, Perth and Hobart. But the movement was definitely most spectacular in Sydney and in regional centres in the state of New South Wales. And this is where the construction boom of the time was very much centred, and the union branch most committed to defence of the environment. Now, this union's guiding principle, which underpinned this extraordinary action, was the concept that it developed, the concept of the social responsibility of labour, that workers had a right to insist that their labour not be used in harmful ways. Now, obviously in the context of global warming, this principle of the social responsibility of labour takes on renewed significance. But what are the prospects in the present of such a movement? Well, to use an ecologically unsound metaphor, it might help to drill down into the Green Bans movement to understand the potential for such a movement again in the future. How did this movement develop? Why did these builders' labourers become ecological actors? Well, it started really during the 1960s when the union became increasingly concerned about the boom in office block development and pleaded instead for the construction of socially useful projects. They pointed out that there were millions of square feet of vacant office space in Sydney's centre as a result of this construction boom, while people looking for their first homes or flats could find nothing. And it argued that the 60% of the building industry's resources must be diverted into construction of public amenities such as hospitals, kindergartens, creches, houses, to channel resources away from building useless office buildings which stand idle in the major cities. They wanted limited resources to be used in the public interest, and obviously there are parallels here with the case for green jobs rather than brown ones. Also, the role of builders' labourers heightened their awareness of damage and destruction. They were the ones who broke the ground when this kind of public vandalism was taking place, and their involvement in demolition, getting rid of the old to make way for the monstrous new, gave them the power to challenge developers. And they were crucial in the early stages of construction. So they had significant industrial power, which they chose to use in defence of the environment. So perhaps there are possibilities here for a similar process of alienation to occur amongst workers expected to continue working in fossil fuel industries, and therefore to take that important leap from radical consciousness to militant industrial action. But of course they must be sustained and supported through the support of the international trade union movement, and hopefully through government policies that can underpin just transition strategies. Another aspect of the Green Bans movement with clear parallels in the climate change period is that the union was especially mindful of specifically working class interests in restraining ecologically damaging development, because workers suffered most from environmental problems. The union would say to the members, okay, who lives in the least leafy suburbs? Who's got the most traffic running through their streets? Who has the most pollution and so on? And so a lot of the bans were placed in defence of residential areas threatened by motorway construction. And the union always emphasised that workers had particular interests in good environmental planning because workers suffered most from environmental issues. And obviously that's true with climate change, that poorer people in poorer countries produce fewer emissions, but they're going to suffer most from climate change, either through becoming submerged or just not having the resources as individuals to buy their way out of living in particularly badly affected areas, not able to buy air conditioning, not able to move to higher ground, etc., etc. The New South Wales Builders Labourers Federation also carefully presented its challenge to capitalist developers as urgently necessary action for the common good, the general good, that it was protecting the many from the few and the planet from the profiteers, that it was articulating the general interest of all except developers and their accomplices. When the union announced that it would refuse to demolish any of the 1,700 buildings in New South Wales recommended for preservation by the National Trust, it stated this. It said, "Anyone with a conscience has to speak up. The building industry has gone mad. We don't want the next generation to condemn us for slapping up the slums of tomorrow." And appeal to reason always underpinned its arguments. It said, "The unplanned, environmentally destroying, unstable, chaotic conditions abounding in this industry must be changed in the interest of all parties and the general public." And obviously, appeal to reason is a crucial aspect of the struggle against climate change. Taking the climate science seriously, practicing the precautionary principle because it is the more rational strategy. Then there's the lesson about industrial power. The union not only imposed bans, but also threatened to withdraw their labour from projects other than disputed ones in order to defend its bans. For example, the first Sydney area green ban in June 1971 was to stop a private developer building luxury houses on a part of the foreshore of Sydney Harbour that was a public green reserve. And to stop this, the building workers on a office project of the same developer sent a telegram to this developer saying, "If you attempt to build on Kelly's Bush, this half-completed building will remain so forever as a monument to Kelly's Bush." So the developer decided it was not going to risk developing Kelly's Bush, and Kelly's Bush has remained an open public reserve ever since, with a nice plaque to commemorate that green ban. And the union was also prepared to defend its bans on picket lines and at demonstrations, and of course it was supported enthusiastically by the resident action groups that mushroomed in this period. So the Green Bans movement persuaded environmentalists and resident activists of the value of working class action and power, and it radicalised these environmentalists further. The popular Green Bans movement slogan of "people before profits" was inspired by the way that the builders' labourers had started by questioning the products of their own labour, and so the resident activists started to query the nature of production under capitalism. Now that connection between class and nature has been theorised in ecological Marxism for decades now, and ecological Marxism points to firstly the usual well-known first contradiction of capitalism, its tendency to economic crisis, but also to its second great contradiction, its tendency to destroy the environment on which it depends for its profit-making, thus hastening its own destruction. And that crisis is caused by underproduction of the conditions of production, the way that capitalist enterprises always externalise costs and fail to renew or repair them. So ecosystems are continually damaged. And these two contradictions of capitalism ensure that capitalist economies are characterised by, on the one hand, underuse of labour resources and overuse of environmental resources. So corporations reduce labour costs and use the cheapest production methods possible, regardless of ecological consequence. So employment options are restricted at the very same time as the planetary environment is degraded. And it's those two obvious glaring contradictions of capitalism that generate the social movements of labour and of environmentalism. So these two great movements are essentially compatible, despite the rhetoric that is always pushed by conservative media and politicians that aims to divide these movements from each other and to create this mythology, this false dichotomy of jobs versus environment, when in fact there are many, many more jobs in a green economy than in a extractive fossil fuel-based one. And obviously, as the Green Bans movement shows, red-green social movement cooperation is the best way to engage in effective climate change mitigation. The Green Bands movement is an inspiring example of what such cooperation can achieve, and thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you about it.